Spider-Man the Animated Series is definitely one of the most iconic superhero shows we've ever gotten, and it competes with the likes of Batman the Animated Series, Justice League the Animated Series, Batman Beyond, Static Shock, Spectacular Spider-Man. This is without a doubt one of the most popular and influential cartoon series that we have ever gotten for a superhero. However, not only did it have to contend with the likes of Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series, it also had to contend with studio censorship. Because you see, although Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series did have certain guidelines they had to work around, Spider-Man the Animated Series, also referred to as Spider-Man 1994, without a doubt had the most impact from censorship and limitation far greater than anything any other series had to deal with around that time. And that's why today we're talking Spider-Man 1994, limitations, censorship, and restrictions. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright, talking censorship around Spider-Man 1994. Yes, I'm going to call it Spider-Man 1994, Spider-Man the Animated Series. So a lot of people praise this cartoon for doing a lot of great things, myself included. It is the cartoon that first introduced me to the character of Spider-Man. It is the cartoon that I and a lot of other comic book fans have grown up on, and as a result, a lot of people definitely hold this series in high regard. However, even despite all of the praise, a lot of people do definitely notice some of the censorship that did happen that did cause severe limitations for this series overall. One of the biggest jokes around this series is that Spider-Man never throws a punch. He will not punch his opponents. And when you're talking about this specific series, that is true, technically, but also technically not. You see, one of these limitations around censorship for the character of Spider-Man around this time was that the studios and networks viewed Spider-Man as a character that was too strong to punch his opponents with a closed fist. So anytime he was battling against his opponents, he was not able to use a closed fist to punch his opponent. Instead, this led to a lot of kicks, a lot of him webbing up his enemies. However, not only was Spider-Man forced to use his webs as a means to stop his enemies, but even what he could do with those webs was very much so limited. You see, they had rules specifically about how he could web up his opponents. He was not able to cover their entire face in webbing. He could not web directly over their mouth for a prolonged period. Now again, they did get away with this in certain episodes. They do have Venom webbed up. A vast majority of his upper body is covered in webbing. However, they got around this by not letting it be shown for very long, and additionally, he was shown to break out of it very easily because one of their biggest things was they could not have Spider-Man's webbing have the effect of showing suffocation or characters being at risk to be suffocating as a result of Spider-Man's webbing. So that was something that they did have to heavily monitor, in addition to him not being able to throw punches. And then that is when you get into a ton of grappling. I can't tell you how many times Spider-Man would swing in just to tackle his opponent. They would roll around on the ground, and Spider-Man would either get blasted off or Spider-Man would end up webbing up his opponent. This was not by accident. This was by design because the studio would not allow for this cartoon to show Spider-Man with a closed fist punching an enemy. However, the enemies also were not technically allowed to punch Spider-Man, which is why you will very rarely see a character in this show actually throw a closed fist punch. However, even though it wasn't supposed to happen, they did still find little workarounds to do this. And one of those workarounds was Spider-Man punching inanimate objects. You see, Spider-Man not punching anyone or anything throughout the entire series is a myth. Now, yes, he does not punch any actual person. However, he does still close his fist and throw multiple punches throughout this series. One of the most notable times he does this is when he's fighting against Scorpion. Scorpion turns around and tries to hit Spider-Man with his tail, only for Spider-Man to hit that tail with the meanest 2 to 3 piece combo we have ever seen. However, that being said, Spider-Man in this moment had to acknowledge how much his hands hurt from delivering these punches to Scorpion's adamantium tail. This was to help show how hard Scorpion's tail was and also how durable his tail was. Therefore, to show the audience and the executive heads that Spider-Man's punches, although he is incredibly strong, were not able to do any actual bodily harm. Number one, because they were thrown against a literal tail. However, number two, because of the density and the strength of the material that said tail was made out of. So that was one way they did kind of get around the whole no punching thing for this series. Another time was when they used automatons. Spider-Man was technically allowed to punch these, or any time Hydra Man was introduced into the situation. They did have a lot more freedom with this character, with what they were able to do around this character. However, speaking of Hydra Man, that brings up another thing we have to talk about, because they were not allowed to show character deaths in this series. At least technically not. You see, as I mentioned before, Hydra Man definitely was an avenue for the creators to have Spider-Man go in combat against someone who would not show bodily harm, because his entire body was made by water, so he could not technically sustain injuries the same way as normal people do. So they decided to take this method and just amp it up to the max when they did show Mary Jane, or rather the clone of Mary Jane, evaporate away into nothing. And yes, I know she was a clone. And yes, I know she was literally made of water. However, the fact that this show was so heavily censored and had so many limitations, and yet still gave us one of the most gut-wrenching deaths. Yes, it is a death. We were bonded with this character, even though she was a clone of Mary Jane. We were bonded with her for an entire season. We saw her marry Spider-Man. We saw Spider-Man reveal that he was Peter Parker to this clone. I would argue we as an audience had more of an attachment to the clone of Mary Jane than we ever did to the actual Mary Jane in this continuity, because the moments we spent with clone Mary Jane were much more intimate and much more impactful, not only for the character of Spider-Man, but also for the overall story and for Peter Parker. So then the fact that we had to witness this character that we were pretty attached to literally evaporate into nothing, and her last moments were telling Peter Parker that if any part of her was like the real Mary Jane loved Peter Parker more than anything in the world. And as she evaporates away, all we hear is Spider-Man scream in his crazy gut-wrenching scream that he is so iconic for, by the way. Absolutely loved anytime he would do that. It was absolutely traumatizing, which definitely furthers my point that censorship realistically in comic book shows just does not have its place, as they were still able to have a workaround for character deaths that were extremely gut-wrenching. Watching Mary Jane Watson evaporate away into nothing is very much so as traumatic as seeing an actual character die, at least in my opinion. However, talking about character deaths, we did not just have Mary Jane Watson's clone evaporate, we also had the death of Mysterio. Now, as I said, deaths were very limited. They had to execute these deaths in a very specific way. One rule around these deaths: Spider-Man could not be directly involved. Therefore, he could not throw someone off a building. He could not throw them into a car. He could not throw a car onto someone, have it explode, and that results in their death. And that was no different when it came to Mysterio's death, as Spider-Man had literally nothing to do with it. In fact, this episode actually depicted Spider-Man and Mysterio working together to defeat this enemy who had kidnapped Mary Jane. This person named Miranda, who was an actress, wanted to steal Mary Jane's body. However, she was unsuccessful at this. Mysterio later reveals that the machines he developed actually never worked. He just wanted to keep Miranda alive. He wanted to give her hope. When she realizes this, however, instead of thanking Quentin and them deciding to try to live together in some sort of happiness, she decides to just blow everything up in the cave underneath. Luckily, she decides to let our main characters go, that being Mary Jane Watson, the clone of Mary Jane Watson, by the way, and Spider-Man. They are able to escape. However, before they escape, Mysterio decides he is going to stay there, and Spider-Man makes a point to try to get him out of there. However, Mysterio refuses and wants to stay there. This was also part of what the network needed from Spider-Man. Not only that he was not directly involved in the death of characters, whether they be villains or civilians, however, he also had to show effort in saving these people. This is why when it came to things even like the Green Goblin getting blasted into that portal by his glider, Spider-Man Spider-Man did make an effort to save him. Even though he was incredibly angry at what happened because of Green Goblin losing Mary Jane, the real Mary Jane, her vanishing, and Spider-Man showing that rage, they still showed Spider-Man going to save Norman Osborn. They took off the mask of Green Goblin, they had him beg for Spider-Man's help, and Spider-Man was going to help. The only reason it didn't work out was because the portal was becoming stronger, and Green Goblin decided that he himself was going to make the choice to try to send Spider-Man into this portal. However, Spider-Man noticed this, dodged the glider, and the glider ended up hitting Norman Osborn, launching him into the portal, and he ended up disappearing, only to be seen in different visions or watching Harry later on. But whether he died or not, it was still important for the network that Spider-Man was shown trying to save this character. However, that is essentially all we have as far as near character deaths or punching limitations. But the other limitations get even crazier when you consider the villains that Spider-Man has. One of the major limitations around censorship specifically was anything to do with blood, which you may say to yourself, well, yeah, it's a kid's cartoon. That makes total sense that they wouldn't have any blood or even any mention of the word blood. However, when you consider one of Spider-Man's really big adversaries was a literal vampire in Morbius, and this is a storyline in which they not only decided to do, but they doubled down on this storyline to the point where they not only had Blade, but they also had Blade's mother involved, having an entire storyline surrounding not just Morbius, but also surrounding other vampires. So considering all these different vampires, it is really crazy that they were not allowed to even mention the word blood. So instead of a vampire biting your neck and sucking the blood out, what they did, they had two different methods. Vampires were still allowed to have fangs, however, they weren't allowed to be shown biting you. One of the methods was what they did with Morbius. They inserted little circular pores onto his palm, so when he would touch a person, he would be able to feed upon them. However, they also further changed things with Morbius and other vampires by not only having those pores be the main way vampires could feed, but they also weren't feeding upon blood. Instead of blood, it was plasma, so they would be feeding over plasma throughout their time in this series. Every time they would show up, they would mention feeding upon plasma rather than feeding upon blood. And not only did Morbius have those pores in his hand, but other vampires could essentially just put their hands on your shoulders or grab onto you, and that's how they were able to feed. We actually never really saw the pores or anything else on other characters aside from Morbius, so we really don't know how their feeding in particular works. All we do know is that they weren't allowed to actually bite anyone, and they weren't feeding based upon blood, they were feeding based upon plasma. However, speaking of Blade and his blades, that was another thing that was severely limited in this series. You see, any type of swords were strictly prohibited from the series. They didn't want to see any characters getting cut, whether that was Spider-Man or whether that was any of the villains. So they did technically have a workaround with this as well, giving blades to only robots being negatively affected by blades, or giving the character of Blade special blades that had different effects. There was one that it was practically like a lightsaber, and we never actually got to see what it could do if it hit someone. It realistically only worked against inanimate objects. He would often use it to cut things, use it to break out of different shackles that he had been trapped in. However, any type of swords were not to be used in an offensive manner against other people. They could realistically only be used in a defensive sense unless it was being used against robots. Robots were very much so a very big out for the creators of this show. They could essentially do anything they wanted to robots because robots aren't people, they're robots. Sorry, AI. However, the limitations don't end there, because if you watch this series, you would be able to see pretty early on that they did not have guns. Well, again, technically they had guns, however they did not look anything like a normal gun, and this was by design. Not only did they not look like guns, they also did not function like guns. They were literally firing lasers out of them, and these lasers really didn't do much harm of any. I don't believe we saw really anyone get hit by any of these except for Spider-Man one time later on. I believe it was around season 4 when he is stopping that robbery that Robbie was involved in, when he was framed in season season 4. However, aside from these instances, I really don't think the lasers actually hit anyone. There may have been a time when Spider-Man was in the symbiote suit. He may have gotten hit by a laser or two. However, it really didn't do anything drastic. And again, this was by design, as the guns were very strictly censored in this series. But speaking of guns being strictly censored, we cannot forget about someone who is an actual gun nut, and that is the Punisher. Now, how do you have the Punisher appear in a series that is heavily censored to the point where it doesn't let you just off people whenever you want, when the Punisher's main thing is that he offs the bad guys? Well, you have him go up against the main hero, someone you know for a fact he cannot kill, not only from a power perspective, but also from an audience perspective. Spider-Man is not someone we would want to see the Punisher take out, so we are inherently rooting against the Punisher in this moment. So because of that, we are going to be much more lenient when it comes to non-lethal action. They also decide to write in there, very smartly by the way, that the Punisher was starting to worry about his public perception, and therefore lethal force was to be prohibited. This is something that he himself mentioned the very first time we see him in the series, and that's why he very much so tried not to kill anyone anytime he was on screen, and he ended up not, partially because of the censorship, but also partially because it was written in there, and very well written, I might say, because it does make sense. Frank Castle, after being the Punisher for so long, does start to worry about his public perception at least a little bit, especially when he is being encouraged by the person that he is working very closely with. So it makes sense that lethal force was becoming something that wasn't utilized as much by the Punisher. Not only that, the only opponent that the Punisher really faces off against is the Man Spider when Spider-Man does transform into that beast. So once again, he's going up against someone that he realistically wouldn't be able to kill anyway. So even deadly force wouldn't really be seen as deadly force in that scenario. However, since we are talking about deadly force, we cannot leave off one of the final depictions of censorship throughout this entire series, and that was anything to do with the symbiotes. You see, Venom and Carnage are two of Spider-Man's most iconic villains, and one of the things that they tend to do is eating people, biting people's heads off. This is something they have done in many projects, from movies to video games to many instances in the comics. This is what they do. They feed upon people. I'm pretty sure Venom ends up doing it more, and Carnage more so just skewers people with his blades, which also was changed. He didn't have blade tentacle things. He had tentacle things that could just grab you and electrocute you and or stun you to knock you out. However, one of the other changes with Carnage was that he was also not allowed to be a serial killer. They just depicted him as an incredibly dangerous person who is out to hurt a lot of people. Obviously, they weren't going to show him just brutally murdering multiple people or even mention the fact that he was a serial killer. And this is one that I put on the list that I actually don't mind and really doesn't bother me, because it doesn't take away from his character, at least not his character that we saw in this universe. But I'm interested to hear what all of you think. Do you think these limitations really hindered this series, or did you not really notice any of these limitations, any of your watch throughs of this series? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.